Hello. It's very nice to hold this webinar, thanks to Boris Anatolievich, who proposed this idea. Today, I want to talk about the Gospel events from the perspective of the new chronology. Perhaps you have read our books, Tsar of the Slavs, Russia and Rome, Christ was born in Crimea, God of War, and a few other books. However, I would like to present this as a separate narrative. First of all, I want to draw your attention to this image currently on the screen. We are sometimes accused of rejuvenating the time of Christ, suggesting that according to the new chronology, Christ lived only 800 years ago instead of 2,000 years ago. Therefore, it might seem like we are making the era of Christ much younger. In reality, this is a deep misconception. In this image, I tried to represent the traditional chronology at the top and the new chronology at the bottom. In the traditional chronology, the era of Christ is considered the 1st century AD. It appears to have older dates compared to the new chronology, which places it in the 12th century AD. However, I marked with a red line the events that are considered to be known to us. These events, as we know them from textbooks, go back to 4000 BC, 3000 BC, 1000 something BC, 700 something BC, and so on. In other words, this entire timeline is populated with events. In Scaliger's traditional chronology, the era of Christ is even closer to the end of this timeline. Although I marked it in the middle, it actually lies closer to the end of the historical era. A huge number of events supposedly occurred before Christ, which gives rise to the problems I will explain later. In the new chronology, in an absolute sense, the date of Christ's birth is later. However, in the new chronology, all the events that are more or less known to us today begin from that time. In the new chronology, the Nativity of Christ, and indeed the Gospel events, are placed at the dawn of our history. Before the Gospel era, only isolated fragments and some astronomical events have reached us from earlier epochs. These fragments are very faint and provide little information. Therefore, in a relative sense, and the relative sense is crucial here, in the new chronology, the era of Christ becomes much more ancient than it was in traditional chronologies. This is because, in the new chronology, it is the oldest era of known history. Obviously, something existed before that, but we know very little about it. If we were to describe it in 2 words, we don't know. Firstly, according to the new chronology, there are no sources that have reached us from the period before Christ. However, we can make some assumptions. According to modern research, in 535 AD, there was an explosion and eruption of a massive volcano called Proto-Krakatoa. It is believed that this event left traces in ice cores on both the northern and southern poles. Glaciologists, who drill ice cores from the northern and southern poles, examine these cores to study what was in the atmosphere in different years. A mysterious spike was discovered long ago. They didn't find sulfur, but something related to the volcanic eruption simultaneously occurred in both the northern and southern poles in 535 AD. The same traces from that year were found in the subpolar juniper, which has been growing there for thousands of years. As a result, a puzzle arises about what happened in 535 AD. This is being discussed in modern science. Lately, people have begun to conclude that it was the eruption of the largest volcano, which would have devastated any civilization. Such volcanoes occasionally erupt, leading to sulfur rains and a decade-long winter. Almost all life on Earth dies. Fine needles expelled from the volcano can clog the respiratory tracts of living creatures. Interested individuals can find information about this on the internet. There are informative videos that describe what happens during the eruption of a volcano of such size, where the caldera area is thousands of square kilometers. Until recently, it was believed that the last such eruption occurred 60,000 years ago. It was the Toba volcano in the present-day Toba Lake region of Indonesia. This lake has the dimensions of its caldera, approximately 3,000 square kilometers. A volcano of this size is capable of wiping out most life on Earth. After 10 years, a rapid resurgence of life begins. Those who survived start anew. During such eruptions, many species of living creatures disappear, and these events happen from time to time on Earth. It was thought that the last major eruption occurred 60,000 years ago. This was considered the bottleneck when the Earth's population decreased so much that our common male ancestor, so-called Adam, lived 60,000 years ago. At least, this has been studied for the white race. In reality, according to the latest research, it happened much closer to our time. It occurred in 535 AD, just 1500 years ago. So, if this is true, then we can say that before 535 AD, there was virtually nothing, and whatever existed was destroyed. The small number of people who survived eventually gave rise to our civilization. In other words, the starting point is unknown. It is presumed to be 535 AD, but it is still uncertain. According to the new chronology, the period from this starting point, the emergence of our civilization, to the 12th century, is considered a dark age, and almost no historical information from that time has come down to us. The 12th century is essentially the beginning of our civilization. More precisely, it's not the absolute beginning, which was earlier, but it is where the roots of our culture, traditions, and everything present in all religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, lie. We exclude some primitive African beliefs or certain tribes that were isolated from civilization. They have everything their own and independent. However, what lies at the core of the culture of all civilized nations is what I'm referring to. The term, civilized nations, is ambiguous. Anyone can call themselves civilized. To be more precise, I am referring to all nations that traditionally practice agriculture. Because our civilization is an agricultural civilization, all nations engaged in agriculture, and I'm talking about them today, have their culture and traditions traced back to the 12th century, to the time of Christ. This is all according to the new chronology. Then, these roots of civilization branched out. This center of civilization spread across the earth. It expanded, and some of its branches remained isolated for long periods. Over time, they changed to the point of being unrecognizable, as is the case with Chinese culture. In reality, it is even more recent. Many cultures today are considered independent, But when they were studied in the 19th century, it was discovered that their beliefs were remarkably similar. There was some woman with a baby, some God who was conceived immaculately or miraculously. Then, he died and resurrected. There was a scientific discipline called comparative religion, and then it was first revealed. It was concluded at that time that Christianity was just a myth. Why? They reasoned as follows. Christ lived in the 1st century. Let's look at some ancient Egyptian religion, which dates back thousands of years before that. It's right here. Now let's examine Buddhism, Hinduism. They are all dated to much earlier times. And, as comparative religion scholars in the 19th century pointed out, we see the same legends, the same conceptions of gods in these religions as in Christianity. From this, they logically concluded that Christians in the 1st century AD or slightly later simply gathered information from ancient beliefs and wrote the Gospel, which is essentially a literary work based on ancient beliefs. Therefore, Christianity emerged, which is actually founded on literary creativity, with its roots going back to the beliefs of ancient peoples. If you have watched the movie, The Master and Margarita, it starts with this. Bulgakov begins his novel with the scene where on Patriarch's pawns, Berlioz and a modern poet with pen name, Homeless, are having a conversation. Berlioz tells Homeless, "You wrote an atheistic poem about Christ, but your Christ is depicted as a living person. In reality, there was no Christ. There was an ancient God, ancient beliefs, and Christians didn't invent anything new. They simply compiled the gospel from ancient beliefs." This debate between Berlioz and Homeless was not arbitrarily created by Bulgakov. This was the very idea that captivated the minds of intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century. It was during this time that the decline of all Christian churches began, with a sharp decline in parishioners. Intellectuals stopped attending churches by the late 19th century. Atheism emerged, and Bolshevik atheism traces its roots back to this logic that arose in the mid-19th century. Therefore, the new chronology defeats this logic. Although we do not touch upon religious matters, we are sometimes accused of undermining Christianity. In fact, it's just the opposite. At least, the new chronology does not contradict Christian dogmas, while the traditional chronology directly contradicts them. This must be well understood. If someone wants to bury their head in the sand and pretend that the modern version of history does not contradict Christianity, they are simply doing so out of insufficient education. The modern version of history and chronology directly contradicts Christianity precisely because of the picture I have just described, while the new chronology does not contradict it. Of course, it is a science. It cannot confirm the Christian line, but it also doesn't contradict it. This is the first point I would like to emphasize. Now let's go through the Gospel events, the biography of Christ, as it is described in the new chronology, and I will accompany it with old images that illustrate the new chronology version. I will start from the very beginning. I should note preliminarily that if you look at various modern films and pictures of Christ, you will see a beggar in rags walking barefoot in the desert, with ragged apostles following him. Even in Bulgakov's novel, The Master and Margarita, if you remember, the Christ figure, who is called Yeshua ha-Natsri, is also depicted as a beggar. When Christ is portrayed as a beggar, it reflects a very late depiction of gospel events. This depiction probably emerged in the 19th century, maybe the 18th, but unlikely. I think it's the 19th century. I can't say for sure, but at least in works from the 16th to the 17th centuries, in icons and paintings, a completely different attitude towards gospel events is shown. Today, historians call this portrayal naive and ignorant, an attempt to depict historical events in contemporary clothing, and so on. It would have been possible if both depictions had existed. Some would have portrayed those events in contemporary clothing, while others would not. There would have been different paintings, but in reality, they are all the same. If you look at works from the 16th to the early 18th century, Christ is always depicted in royal garments. However, somewhere from the late 18th to the early 19th century, he is portrayed as a beggar in rags. So, there is a clear boundary. The depiction of Christ as a beggar and a shag rag is a consequence of the modern, generally accepted historical concept. It is completely inconsistent with what is written in the Gospel. Let's begin. I will briefly comment. According to the new chronology, modern history begins with a wedding. This is also seen in ancient myths. If you look into some mythological dictionaries, what is the starting point of history? According to the beliefs of ancient Greeks and Romans, history begins with a divine wedding where Ares threw an apple on the table, leading to the Trojan War. It starts with a wedding, and as a result, everyone becomes embroiled in conflict, leading to the Trojan War. According to the myths and legends of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, this is the beginning of history. And in the new chronology, it is also the same. History begins with a wedding. According to the new chronology, it was a divine wedding because it was a wedding in the Holy Family, in the divine family. The Holy Family was an ancient royal family that appeared at some point, starting from the dawn of our history, conventionally in the year 535 AD. We only see events from the 12th century onwards. We do not see earlier epochs. But in the 12th century, a large Mediterranean state emerged with its capital on the Bosporus, and there was a king and a royal family. The royal family was considered as gods of that time. Christ was a member of this royal family. He was a god by virtue of being a member of this family. We must understand that there is Christianity that emerged after Christ, and it worships only one God. The idea of monotheism arose with Christ and apostolic Christianity. Before that, the royal family was considered gods. It was polytheism. There was a prince, pushed aside from the throne. At that time, the capital was located at the northern end of the Bosporus, in Jerusalem, also known as Troy. Today, it is the fortress of Yeros. I will show you some photos of this place later. The prince leaves from there to a distant province, which was Vladimir Suzdal, Russia. The empire at that time was a maritime empire, and the means of transportation were water-based. They had control over the coastlines of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. First, the Mediterranean, then the Black Sea, because the initial capital was in Egypt. They had also colonized all the major rivers flowing into these seas, including the Don River. They made their way by dragging to the banks of the Volga, which were also colonized. But those were distant provinces. The capital was located at the northern end of the Bosporus, in the city of Jerusalem, also known as Troy. The prince travels to Vladimir Suzdal, Russia, the city of Galich. At that time, the main capital city was Galich-Kostrovskoye. There were no other cities yet, neither Vladimir nor Suzdal. Today, it is called Vladimir Suzdal, Russia, based on later names of capitals, but I will use this name. He goes there, meets a beautiful princess, and marries her. Before the wedding, there is a wedding contest. He kills a bear in the contest. Over time, in myths, this was transformed into the killing of a dragon. Please note that here he kills a dragon, but in reality, he kills a bear. The audience watches as he does it, and the princess holds the dragon, that is, the bear, on a leash. Everywhere, in all icons, it is depicted that they hold the dragon on a leash. So, it's not just any dragon. It is a tied dragon. That is, a tame one. In fact, it was a bear that was captured, kept on a leash, and then it was released, and the prince killed it, thereby gaining the right to marry. According to local Russian customs, he performed a heroic feat and married the beautiful princess. All of this later gave rise to a vast number of legends. One of them is the ancient Russian legend about the origin of Russians. They are said to be descended from the marriage of Hercules and the Rusalka, a water nymph. Hercules got lost, went somewhere far away, and met the Rusalka, whom he kissed. Just kissed her. This sounds like the dogma of Immaculate Conception. He just kissed her, and she immediately became pregnant and gave birth to triplets, 3 sons, one of whom was Rus, and from him, the Russians descended. This is such a legend. Even in the 16th century, our ancestors wore amulets with the image of the Rusalka. They are still frequently found in excavations, with inscriptions stating that it is the Rusalka, the ancestress of the Russians. This is one version of this legend, but there are many more, and I won't list them all. The beginning was a divine wedding, followed by an engagement. This is another picture, the engagement of Joseph and Mary. First, the contest before the wedding, then the engagement. They are fair-haired, fair-eyed, all young. Joseph is depicted here not as an old man. This is the correct depiction. Later, he was portrayed as an old man. Joseph, also known as George the Victorious, Hercules, the god of war Mars, and Ares. He was a very famous and renowned warrior in his time. He was a prince and, at the same time, an invincible warrior. In myths and legends, he is reflected as an exceptionally strong, brave, and warlike person. Ares, Mars, the Egyptian god Horus, George the Victorious, and so on. In the Bible, he is Joseph, but later, he was turned into an old man. What happens after this? After this, the coronation takes place. That is, after becoming the wife of the prince, the Virgin Mary also became the princess. The royal crown was placed upon her. Today, such images are interpreted as Christ himself crowning the Virgin Mary. He has grown up and is crowning his mother. This is how they interpret it. Let's take a look at another very interesting image of this kind. It's the same situation. By the way, pay attention to the red garments. Purple clothing was a sign of royal lineage. Only members of the royal family or their relatives and close associates could wear purple clothing and purple footwear. It was the royal color. Common people were not allowed to wear such garments. If you remember, in the Gospels, there was the purple robe of Christ. It was precious, and after his crucifixion, soldiers cast lots for it near the cross. It was a precious garment and also crimson, that is, red. This is the prince, and this is the Virgin Mary, and he is crowning her. They say it's Christ. Well, let's see what's between them. Do you see the circle, which is painted over? It's somewhat unclear what that circle represents. Now I'll show it in close-up. This is the actual crowning, and here's the circle. See? It's the face of a baby. Here's the ear, but it's painted over. It's the face of a baby, deliberately obscured to avoid unnecessary questions. But why is it painted over? Because if the infant Christ is depicted here, then who is this Christ at the same time depicted as an adult and a baby? Why is he here? In that case, if it's a baby, the iconographic logic is completely destroyed. Therefore, they painted it over to obscure. But in reality, according to the new chronology, it's not Christ. It's George the Victorious, also known as Prince Isaac Komnenos, according to Byzantine history. He is Saint Joseph, the husband of the Virgin Mary, and he is crowning her. He himself is of royal lineage and places the royal crown upon her. And here, between them, their son Christ is depicted. Here, the logic is preserved. But nowadays, such images are obscured. This is an Egyptian representation of the same event. It's the Annunciation. Well, not exactly the same. There was the coronation of the Queen, and here it's the Annunciation. This is Archangel Gabriel as depicted in the Egyptian version. He brings the good news. And this is the Virgin Mary. She is depicted here with cow horns. Cow horns are a symbol of the Virgin Mary in Egyptian, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions. Why is the cow a sacred animal? Why don't they eat cows in India until now? Because the cow is a symbol of the Virgin Mary. She nursed Christ with her milk, and that's why her symbol is the cow. He brings the good news, but he brings it to both of them at once. This is precisely Horus. He is the warrior Egyptian god. He is also Saint George, also her husband. So here, the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary is depicted, but her husband stands next to her. He is not sidelined. He is there next to her when they bring the good news. This is the Dendera temple, next to which the depiction I'm telling you about is located. This is the Nativity. This is a modern painting. How is the Nativity depicted? In a cave. There is livestock in the cave. This is the manger. What is a manger? Mangers are feeding troughs for livestock. During their journey, Joseph and Mary didn't find an inn, and they stopped and had to go into a cave to have at least some roof over their heads. There were livestock, there was a manger. The Virgin Mary gave birth right in such conditions. And the swaddled baby was placed right in the feeding trough for livestock, that is, in the manger. That's why today in Russian language the place where little children are raised is called mangers. But in general, mangers are feeding troughs for livestock, precisely because of this. Let's see how the Nativity is depicted in icons. I think this is Andrei Rublev's icon. A tall cliff, and in this tall cliff, there's a cave. In a rocky area, in this cave, Christ's nativity takes place. This is all according to the new chronology. We searched for the birthplace of Christ for a long time and found it. This is a rocky shore. This is Crimea, Cape Violent. A very picturesque place with these high cliffs. This is from the other side. The cave is behind me. And this is from the other side. Here's a tall cliff, and in this tall cliff, there's a cave. And nearby is the church of St. George the Victorious, but it was recently built. This is that church. It existed before but was later destroyed, then rebuilt. It was reconstructed several times. And this is the entrance to the cave. This is the cave. It's now divided into two parts. There is an entrance at the bottom and one at the top. They simply divided it into two parts. Previously, it was one large, tall cave, just as depicted in icons. And to this day, the cave church of the Nativity of Christ is located here. Here's the interior of this church. Services are held there, an altar dedicated to the Nativity of Christ. Icons depicting the Nativity of Christ are hanging there. This is the cave of the Nativity of Christ, and in it, there is the cave church. It has been preserved to this day and is still the Church of the Nativity. According to various legends, there should be a spring nearby. In the Gospels, this is not mentioned, but in icons and legends, there should be a spring nearby. People are not allowed there. The entrance is forbidden, but we were allowed in. The door is nearby. If you go in there, there will be such a place, and there is a spring. The spring is right next to it, about 50 meters away. So, according to the new chronology, Christ was of royal lineage. His earthly father was a prince. He had the right to the throne but was removed from it. In the Byzantine history, this is explained by the fact that he was too warlike, and that's why their father decided to transfer power to another brother. George, also known as Joseph, Isaac, Ares, Mars, is depicted in myths and legends as a very warlike and restless person. He didn't stay in one place, he constantly wandered and fought. And, indeed, he didn't raise Christ. It must be said, why Joseph was eventually moved away from Christ, leaving only the Virgin Mary. He did not raise him, and he did not live long with his beautiful wife. He went on some campaign and started to fight again. In fact, it was the same with Hercules and Rusalka. He was with her for a short time, only met, and then left. He left a bow, left some belongings, and left. And the same thing happened here. Nevertheless, he was a prince. She was a Russian princess. In their marriage, a wonderful baby was born. It is believed that his birth was divine, miraculous, immaculate conception. Around the birth of this baby there are all these Christian dogmas and not only Christian ones. Look at this interesting painting. Here's the Virgin Mary. By the way, she is depicted wearing a turban. She is sitting and holding the baby Jesus on her lap. Next to her on the left is John the Baptist. He is a relative. He is also a member of the Holy Family. And on the right, stands Saint George the Victorious, and under his feet, there's a dragon, that is, a bear. The Virgin Mary is looking at him. In iconography, it is essential who is looking at whom. The younger one always looks at the elder one. Usually, the Virgin Mary is depicted in the center, and the accompanying saints always look at her. She looks at the viewer or somewhere aside. But here, specifically, she is looking at him, as if he were the elder one. Look at how it's depicted. This is a very interesting painting. He does not resemble the accompanying saint. Sometimes saints are depicted as accompanying figures. They can be from a completely different epoch, but they usually look at the Virgin Mary or Jesus from below to above. And here, firstly, he is above, which is also never done. Secondly, the Virgin Mary is looking at him. That is, what is presented here is precisely what we assert in the new chronology. That Saint George the Victorious, also known as Joseph, was her husband. The wife looks at her husband from below to above. And here's the son. This is the Holy Family. Another painting. This is the Virgin Mary with two infants. Again, pay attention to Christ. He is wearing a red garment. She is in red attire, but Christ is entirely in red. And here's the second infant. At least his cloak is red. These are all royal colors. Here's another picture, an icon. Here, the Virgin Mary is also with an infant. She is sitting on a throne with a royal crown and in luxurious clothes. This is how the sacred history was depicted, not as it is today, in rags, in the sand, in the mud. This is Egypt, the Dendera temple. Here, too, the Virgin Mary with an infant or the Egyptian Virgin with an infant, Isis. She has an infant. They are confused. They consider him to be Horus. In fact, Horus is her husband. This is Osiris, who has resurrected. Here's another image of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding. He is older, but she is breastfeeding him. And here's an Indian picture. Also, the Virgin Mary. She's called differently here. She is also with an infant, also sitting. And here, the accompanying figures are blue. This is their symbolism, but Indian symbolism is easily recognizable. The Virgin Mary with an infant. Blue is John the Baptist. He is blue like the blue water. He baptizes, offers water. And the four-headed figure is the four evangelists. That is, John the Baptist, the four evangelists, and the Virgin Mary with an infant. Of course, in Hinduism, they have forgotten much of this. They have interpreted all this with some other meaning. They do not believe that this is Christ. They have attributed some other meanings to all of this. But, in reality, the genuine meaning of these paintings is evangelical. In the Gospels, it is described that Christ, together with the Virgin Mary, was expelled and forced to flee from Herod, who wanted to kill him. Why did he want to kill him? In the Gospels, it is written explicitly, because the wise men said that this child was a king. That is, Herod was afraid that the child would take away his power, and he wanted to kill him. This is entirely correct. That's how it happened. But it was not the newborn child, born into a poor family, whom he was afraid of, so he sent to kill all the children 2 years old and younger. And, of course, he was afraid of the child born into a family that had the right to the throne. Again, Joseph, also known as Isaac Komnenos, was the elder brother of King Herod, and therefore he had the right to the throne. Another matter is that the throne passed to the younger brother. Nevertheless, by law, the throne should have passed to the elder one. He had the right, although he did not claim it. We know from history that he did not want power and did not fight for it. But his son, Christ, got from him the right to rule. And then different scenarios could have occurred. There were two claimants to power. Herod's son, who came from the younger line, through the younger brother, and Christ, who came through the elder brother. There was a division. Therefore, Herod was afraid and tried to get rid of this child. In the end, Christ enters Jerusalem. Recently, a book titled Holy Gospel, direct translation from Church Slavonic, was published. It is an excellent book. It was published this year by the World Union of Old Believers. They took the text directly from the 17th century Moscow print of the Gospels. These Gospels are available, but today not many people read in Church Slavonic. Even the Old Believers now read only excerpts in Church Slavonic. And if they want to read the Gospel from cover to cover, they read the Synodal translation, which is available on every shelf. However, in the Synodal translation, many things are distorted. And if you translate directly, as written in the Church Slavonic books, very interesting things arise. I recommend reading this book. Right now, I don't have time to read excerpts. I especially recommend reading the Gospel of Luke, because it is the most detailed and historical one. There is less theology and more history. If you want to get acquainted with history, it's best to read the Gospel of Luke. Many things are written in black and white there, just like in the New Chronology. I won't read it now, but I highly recommend it. From the text, it follows that Christ is a king. He is given royal honors and called a king. He enters Jerusalem as a king. Everything is described in detail. In the end, he ruled for 3 years, and eventually, a rebellion arose. The rebellion was led by his relative. All these people who had the right to power were relatives. They were one family. He was his relative, Isaac II Angelos, also known as Satan. There is no Satan in the Gospels, but there is in church tradition. Who is Satan? According to church tradition, Satan is the chief angel, the chief servant of God, a high-ranking commander over all the angels who wanted to become God himself and rebelled against God. That's who Satan is. Absolutely correct. He was a very high-ranking official, a relative of the king. He led the rebellion, which turned out to be successful, and they crucified Christ. Here's the crucifixion, one of the pictures. Again, we can see people in rich attire standing at the foot of the cross. This is the Virgin Mary and 2 other women next to her, Mary Magdalene and Mary of Clopas. And 2 men. John, the beloved follower. According to many depictions, the crucifixion took place on the shore of a strait. Here's a cartoon. That is, everything is depicted together. Once again, the crucifixion is depicted. Sometimes they did it on one canvas. Don't think that these are 2 different hills. No, it's the same hill. They are crucifying and taking off the cross. But it all happens on the shore of a strait. Later I'll show you a collection of pictures where the crucifixion is on the shore of a strait. This is a modern icon. 2 men and 3 women. The Virgin Mary and 2 other women. Another painting. On the shore of a sea strait. It's the descent from the cross. Here, the Virgin Mary and two young women. Here is an Indian depiction, how it all reflected in their culture. This is the crucifixion, this is Christ. The cross transformed into a peacock. Nevertheless, the symbol of death, the cobra, remained. The hill, the mountain behind, the water became a pond. Next to it, in the form of a cow, stands the Virgin Mary. As I mentioned before, this is an Egyptian and Hindu symbol, the Virgin Mary breastfeeding Christ. And two women. And on the other side, two men. That's how all of this grew with fantastic details and became mythologized. Nevertheless, the core remained stable. And this is where it all happened, in Jerusalem, also known as Yeros, also known as Troy. Today it is called Yeros. This is an old painting from the 19th century. The view from Jesus' tomb to Yeros, that is, from the place of the crucifixion to Jerusalem. And this is a modern photo of Yeros. There are quite a lot of remains. These two towers, part of the walls. There are more remains of towers at the bottom. These are not all the walls. It is the upper city, where the king lived. But, in general, it was all part of the city, with many walls reaching the Bosporus itself. Here are the gates. Even Yeros is written on a sign. Interestingly, after we published this photo, the Turks tore off this sign. It's not there now, they cut it down. This post was sawn off and taken away somewhere. But when we first saw it, it said, Fortress Yeros. Here's another photo, probably taken at a different time. The Bosporus is visible in the background. It's a view of the Black Sea. It's where the Bosporus flows into the Black Sea. The Bosporus has two currents, in one and the other direction, so it's hard to say where the mouth, the beginning, or the end is. But this is the end of the Bosporus, where it flows into the Black Sea. This is the view from Yeros. And this is the view from the Bosporus. Here is Yeros, Troy, Jerusalem. And this mountain is the highest point of the Bosporus, where the tomb of Jesus is located. It is still called the tomb of Jesus. It's symbolic. There is no tomb there. It is 17 meters long. This is the place of the crucifixion. And it is depicted the same way in icons. Christ goes out with the cross, travels some distance, and ascends the mountain. And behind him, not far away, are huge gates and gate towers. Even in many depictions, these towers are drawn approximately as they have survived today. And here's another interesting old depiction. It shows the baptism of Christ in a sea strait. The city is very similar to Yeros, similar to the Bosporus. Apparently, it was copied from some old paintings. This, I remind you, is the image of Christ from the Shroud of Turin. That's how he looked. This is his icon, the non-handmade Savior. That's how he was depicted in icons. Here's the book I wanted to talk about. Again, according to the new chronology, our history begins with the Gospel events. But since these events are very bright, it's like a flash in the darkness, like a bright dawn. They conveyed quite a lot of information to us. That is, we know a lot about the Gospel events. However, about events later than the Gospel ones, we know little. Then comes a period of obscurity, when little information has come down to us. and then it gradually starts to disperse. The closer to our time, the more we know about history. So, it's not quite evenly. The era of Christ is a bright flash. It stands at the beginning and is more enriched with the events that have come down to us than later eras.
In the Gospel, I don't remember from which apostle, there is an episode from the childhood of Christ when he went to the church on his own and amazed everyone with his wisdom.
Correct, it is in several Gospels.
Joseph and Mary came together to take their son. How can this be reconciled with the assertion that they lived together for a relatively short time?
Firstly, it is not an assertion. It is a conclusion drawn from the memories that have come down to us. Yes, the Gospels mention Joseph, but when Christ grows up, Joseph disappears. So, when I say that they lived together for a relatively short time, I cannot specify the number of years. Perhaps he visited, perhaps he came to see them. He was there at the time of the Nativity. There are legends, there is the Gospel. Indeed, before this event, the Gospel mentions Joseph, but Christ was still young at that time. He was still a child, and then Joseph disappears.
And then there is a gap in the narrative.
The Virgin Mary is present until the very end. She is at the cross, while Joseph disappears.
There is a gap in the narrative from approximately age 12 to 30.
Yes, that's true. Myths that speak about Heracles, Mars, Ares, do not accuse him. But still, they speak about him as a man who doesn't stay long at the family hearth, who cannot stay for long. Does this mean that he left after a year and never returned? Probably not. He could have periodically returned to his family. But he was not constantly with the family. That's what legends and myths convey to us. After that, we can speculate, but I believe that there is some truth in this, because otherwise, the Gospels would have spoken more about Joseph. After all, they do not talk much about him.
Gleb Vladimirovich, if I remember correctly, Aeneas, the brother of Christ Andronikos, is not a blood brother but a named brother. In your books you quote the words of Christ to the Virgin Mary, "This is your son," or "This is my brother." And since the rest of the line of future imperial rulers comes from him, could it somehow affect the reasons for the split between them and the apostles, that is, between the dynastic Christianity and apostolic Christianity? In other words, the apostles did not want to consider non-blood relatives as holy precisely because they were not blood relatives. Have you considered such an option?
Good question. Naturally, we have thought about it. But according to apostolic Christianity, there was the dogma of monotheism. God is one. There is the concept of the Holy Trinity, but that is a separate question and a later dogma. Nonetheless, in three persons is still one God. To consider blood relatives as gods. I understand your question, that being a non-blood relative, he couldn't be called a god, while blood relatives could. I believe that apostolic Christians, as it seems to me, and as it follows from apostolic dogma, did not consider any of Christ's blood or non-blood relatives to be gods. They had the belief that God is one, and Jesus is the Son of God. Later, they combined them or did it immediately, but that is already a matter of dogma, which I won't delve into. But God is one, and a human cannot be called God. However, Christ is not merely a human, and that's why he is considered God. This is apostolic dogma. The earlier dogma, the time of Christ and his family, was different, where the royal family was considered gods. Thus, after Christ's time, two branches of Christianity emerged. One branch, Apostolic Christianity, acknowledged only Jesus as God, the Son of God, and equated him with God. The second branch, adhering to older traditions, considered the ruling family as gods, and they also regarded Jesus as a god, but as their own, family god. These are slightly different things. That's why, when we look at Egyptian art and royal Christianity, there is a somewhat different attitude towards Jesus. Yes, he is a god, but more like their family god. He is closer to them. I don't know the exact words to use, but, as it were, a more familiar attitude towards Christ. Yes, God, by our own God. When it comes to the apostles, their view of Jesus was more exalted. For them, he was God, as we know in today's apostolic Christianity. I think the schism between them, well, it was present in the ideology from the beginning, but during the time of war and conquest, when there are common goals, such differences are usually not given much attention. They come to the forefront when everything is calm, the world is conquered, and there are no common enemies anymore. That's when such disagreements begin. They started precisely when the conquest of the world was completed, when the empire had encompassed all of Eurasia, when everything was seized, and order was established. It was then, when there were no more enemies for Christianity, that these disagreements arose. There were other reasons as well, not just ideological ones, but these also emerged between apostolic Christianity and royal Christianity.
I am reading Kirill Stepanov's question. Dear Gleb Vladimirovich, on what written sources is your reconstruction of the marriage of Joseph and Mary based? According to your version, no sources about it have been preserved.
Some rewritten sources have been preserved. Of course, the original accounts written by witnesses to the events have not survived to the present day. However, since the event was so famous, it has been copied many times. All these copies are distorted, but there are many of them. Do you know how information can be preserved? It can be meticulously copied, or it can be copied very roughly, with many mistakes, but numerous times. It can be copied once without a single error, and that will be good. And it can be copied many times with a large number of errors. Different copies will have different errors. In fact, the latter method is more reliable because one copy might disappear, but many copies will not. Therefore, what we have today is many distorted copies. And we analyze these fragments, each of which is heavily distorted, but there are many of them. By making substitutions, it is possible to reconstruct something. We don't claim that sources have not reached us at all. We are saying that the original sources have not survived to be opened and read in their correct form. Such sources do not exist.
I wanted to ask a question regarding the identity of Joseph George. According to other sources, George is identified with Genghis Khan and Yuri Dolgoruki. And these two figures do not quite match.
Yes, I understand your question. Regarding Yuri Dolgoruki as the founder of Moscow, he is indeed associated with George the Victorious because he came here and founded Moscow in a way. Yuri Dolgoruki is considered the founder of Moscow and the future Moscow Principality. It did not become a principality immediately, but rather over time. This is probably the legend about George the Victorious, about Joseph. As for the identification with Genghis Khan, it was written in our books in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. It was a mistake. We also make mistakes sometimes and we later acknowledged it.
Good evening. Gleb Vladimirovich, I have a question. According to the new chronology, what is your concept for believers, those who believe in Christ and the resurrection of Christ? I am curious how to approach this now because I used to believe. I started reading your books, and now a different understanding is forming. Can you explain briefly?
I started from this point. I can repeat once again that we are engaged in historical research. We do not deal with matters of faith and theology. However, if we look at these questions from the perspective of the new chronology, it opens up the possibility of all Christian dogmas. The new chronology is not a religious doctrine, but it is an historical concept. This historical concept in no way contradicts Christianity. Moreover, Christianity can fully rely on it if desired. On the other hand, when it comes to the modern conventional view of history, Christianity cannot rely on it. This is what I want to convey. And it's no coincidence that in the mid-19th century, a significant number of people stopped believing. Look at history. The churches were full, everyone attended, everyone believed. When did this departure of people from the Orthodox, Catholic, and Christian churches begin? It was in the mid-19th century. And what caused it? Look at history. It was the 19th century, and everything is evident there. It began precisely because of what I explained. It was due to the fact that at the beginning of the 19th century, Europeans traveled to Southeast Asia and Egypt. There was Napoleon's expedition. Somewhere in the 1830s, the description of Egypt was published. By the mid-19th century, material from ancient Egypt and Southeast Asia fell into the hands of scholars. And what did they see? They saw that Christian dogma filled all these ancient beliefs. And if we believe this concept, these ancient beliefs existed before Christ. And this categorically undermines Christian dogma. Obviously, Christian theologians found a way out. According to them, they found a way out. They said, all of this does not concern us. God conveyed to all those pagans in images what would happen later, that Christ would come. And everything concerning his life, he gave to them in the form of these pictures. For some reason the God told pagans who lived before Christ in images about what would happen in the future, about the events related to Christ. He is God, and he can do anything. That's how they responded. But such an answer did not satisfy the educated society. Of course, nobody argued with them. They still give the same answer. If you talk to a Christian theologian, he will respond exactly as they did then. But you know what happened? Upon hearing this answer, people gradually started turning away from the church. And this was gaining momentum. By the end of the 19th century, the intellectuals hardly attended church anymore. It remained only for the peasants who knew nothing about it. The Bolsheviks, with their barbaric methods, wanted to convey to the people what they considered to be a scientific truth, atheism. And as a result, it turned into a massacre with all the ensuing consequences. I want to say that these ideas are not harmless at all. It is one thing to talk about it casually. They talked about it in the 19th century, and in the 20th century, people were executed for it.
May I use my position to ask a few questions myself, Gleb Vladimirovich? Do you have any hypotheses about what might have existed before 535 AD based on what we know? Perhaps some artifacts, mountains, or structures. You know this theory. You keep it in mind. Have you come across anything in your research that could have existed before 535 AD and was built by people?
I don't see any hints in history that anything existed before 535 AD. That something is left. I believe that if there was any civilization, it was not highly developed, and it completely perished.
Is there any point in searching for the remains of the Holy Family and their descendants and heirs? And if so, where should one look?
The remnants of the Holy Family went to the east and established all the Eastern empires, the Indian and the Chinese. Perhaps, the last remnants of the Holy Family were the Manchus. But not the Manchus who were eventually overthrown in the early 20th century. They had no connection to the Manchus anymore. It was a substituted dynasty. The last true-born Manchus were exterminated during the reign of Empress Dowager Cixi in the mid-19th century. When Cixi came to power, she wiped out the entire dynasty. Therefore, there are no Manchus left in China either.
So, searching for them among some European emperors would be a futile endeavor, wouldn't it?
Perhaps among the direct line of Chinese emperors. I'm not sure. In Southeast Asia, all dynasties have changed. The Manchus were eradicated in the mid-19th century, and their dynasty was replaced. The last Manchus are not true Manchus, not the Manchu dynasty. In Thailand, there is still a divine dynasty. Their kings are considered divine, and they are worshipped. You cannot touch them. But even that dynasty was changed in the 18th or 17th century when some military commander took power. So again, it is not an ancient dynasty. There are ruptures everywhere. From what I've seen, ruptures are present everywhere. The Holy Family went to the east and stayed there until the 19th century. But did any of their direct descendants survive? Firstly, they had intermingled significantly with the Eastern peoples and might have only preserved a direct line. But in the direct line, maybe the Japanese emperors? I'm not sure. It needs to be researched.
Gleb Vladimirovich, is there any explanation as to why the relatives of the Virgin Mary decided to pass on the authority over the Slavs to Aeneas specifically? Let me repeat, he was not a blood relative. Could it be that they had no other relatives with a direct blood relation to the Andronikos lineage? After all, there were many children in those times. Is there anything about this in the sources?
This is a very good and relevant question. Of course, what does it mean to just invite a foreign person, not a relative of the ruling dynasty, to govern? This is what the calling of the Varangians is all about. However, it is entirely distorted. Recently, the Russian chronicler was found, and it describes everything very well. In our latest book, Russia and Rome, The Great Conquest of the World, we briefly talk about this. And now, we are going to write a book on this topic called Sloven and Rus, where everything will be described in detail. How did everything happen? The world, then as now, is based on certain conventions. And power is based on conventions. Today, it is based on one set of conventions, while in the past, it was based on different conventions. Russia was a province ruled by princes, while the royal family was in the capital. Certainly, these princes were also relatives of those kings. It was one family. But there was an upper level, a direct line, and many lateral lines. The Russian chronicler vividly describes how a vast country was ruled by Gostomysl. The country was wealthy, they reached Siberia, conquered many territories, but it wasn't ruled by a representative of the upper echelons of the royal dynasty, not a czar, which diminished its significance. This was according to the conventions of that time. In other words, the country had outgrown the level of power it had. So, Gostomysl suggested and said to his subordinates, "Please don't consider this shameful, but Russia is a huge country, and it should be led by a representative of the royal lineage." The Russian chronicler describes in detail how they did it. They summoned Rurik Aeneas. He was a representative of the royal lineage, and thus, they elevated Russia's importance. So, it used to be a province and couldn't say a word against. By placing a representative of the royal lineage at the helm, they, according to the concepts of that time, made a claim to world dominance. But, in reality, the chronicler describes in detail how everything happened. Rurik arrives, and to whom does he pass the power? To Oleg. If you delve into the Russian chronicler, you can see that Oleg was his relative. He was a local ruler, a relative through marriage. Rurik ruled and then handed over power to Oleg as his deputy. Oleg was a local ruler and a relative of Gostomysl, but he was also a relative of Rurik through marriage because he married a Russian woman. After that, Oleg takes care of Rurik's son, Igor, who was already half Russian. Then, Oleg marries him to Olga. And it is well seen in the Russian chronicler that Olga was a relative of Oleg. So, he marries Igor to his relative and passes power to him. And Igor's son was already 3/4 Russian. They did everything very properly. Essentially, the ruling Russian dynasty remained in power. But whereas it was previously princely, it became royal.
Kaaba in Kazan, Bethlehem in Crimea. How and, most importantly, why did they change our history so drastically? What do you think needs to be done to restore the truth?
I cannot answer in a few words why our history was changed. If you want to know in detail, you need to read the book. But the general reason for changing history is always the same. How did they change our history after 1917? They changed it badly? How is history being altered now? History is always changed to suit the interests of the ruling power. In the 17th century, it was changed to favor those who came to power. But how did they come to power? Why did they come to power? Why did they need to change history? Why was it a top priority for them? These are all questions that require detailed answers. We have thoroughly discussed these in the books, but it's not a 5-minute topic.
Did Christ give the basis of ethics? Do unto others, as you would have them do unto you.
In reality, Christ gave a lot. What exactly did Christ offer? He provided a new model of behavior for people. More modern, less primitive, where a person thinks not only about oneself. He presented an example of behavior in a more contemporary society. And what is written in the Gospel gradually became part of our lives. People changed.
Now, I propose to conclude our webinar.
I thank everyone for their attention and for listening.
Then, I suggest saying goodbye. Thank you very much, Gleb Vladimirovich.